One of those days where you'll be working a whole lot on your assignment. Today, you'll be listening to me a lot. So it's going to be one of those where it's pretty much all lecture. And the reason is we're going to be talking about HTML forms, and the book has left out a bunch of stuff that is useful information. By the way, the homework, the after class activity is not due at the end of class. It's due in 2 days. So don't panic and think, oh, he's going to take up all class and I won't have a chance to get it done. It's not due until Thursday. So the book doesn't have a lot of real world experience that I've actually gotten with form writing. So I'm going to be conveying some of that kind of experience to you today, and that's why for the most part it's going to be lecture as opposed to telling you to just work on it. So, and also we're primarily going to be, what I'm going to talk about today is forms. I know the end of the homework, chapter 2 talks about things like links and I think images. I think that's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand. So we are going to dive straight into using HTML forms. So the first thing is, chapter 2 is primarily about non-interactive content. You're just creating a read-only page, things like a book, maybe something for browsing. But chapter 3 is more concerned with interactivity. How do you get data from the client to the server? And one of the ways we do that, or one of the principal ways we do that on a website, is using a form. So if you go to a reservation site, you typically enter some information like your name, maybe at a restaurant, the time you want to be there, the number in your party. And that information gets communicated to the server. So there's 3 basic things that make up an HTML form. So first of all, it starts with the form. Oops, I want this. So there's 3 things with a form. First, it starts with the form tag. And then the second thing is you normally have some number of widgets that are used to gather data or gather info for the server. And the third thing that almost all forms should have is a submit button. Okay, the big 2 things, so now you have this markup, this form, and there are 2 big attributes that it has. So attributes are often information that's not part of the structure of the document, but it's kind of metadata. In this case, it's metadata for the server, how it's transferred to the server. So there's method, and the other one is action. So the method indicates how data is transmitted to the server. The action is the script on the server side that is going to get executed. So the method is how data is transmitted, or how data is sent to the server. And action is the path to a script, server-side script. So it's an address. It can be either a URL or a relative path. So for a method, it can be either get or post. Actually, it should be all capitals. Don't put a comma. It's either or. Okay, so you put, instead of a comma, get. This is what the book doesn't really say. Okay? The book doesn't say that you typically use get for any kind of form that cannot alter information on the server, whereas you tend to use post for any kind of form that can alter data on the server. So get is typically used for forms that don't alter server-side data. So they're browsing only, read only. Okay, in effect, read only. Whereas your post is used for two things, okay? One, forms that modify server-side data. And by server-side data, I typically mean a database. So they do some kind of write. Or if the form data is too big to be transmitted. So get has a limit on the size of the data that can be transmitted. It's fairly small. I don't know if it's 4,000 bytes or it varies seemingly, but if the data is too big, you have to also transmit using post. So used for when data to be sent exceeds a threshold. So typically so get is good for web crawlers that crawl across your website scraping data because they can send requests to the server, get back a result, and display it. So Google does this kind of scraping. Get is also good because you can often access a server-side script without ever actually going through a website. So you can actually do something like if there's a server-side script, say it was at BVZ, maybe foo.php, and then I could, with a question mark, I would provide some name value pairs, like maybe name equals Brad Vanderzanden. Shoot, I forget the separator. Ampersand, thank you. Let's say pet equals smiley. So something like that would actually directly invoke a script on the server side, passing as the key value pairs name and Brad Vanderzanden is the value and pet is the key and smiley is the value. So that's another advantage of posting things with get, because with get, when the form data is transmitted, the form data is explicitly included as part of the so-called URL. So typically with get, there's this URL that the browser constructs that includes the URL of the script plus any form data that is being transmitted. And the form data is separated from the URL by this question mark. And then you get the name or key value pairs, with the key being on the left side, the value being on the right side of the assignment, and the ampersand being the separator. Yes?
You need quotes around that value.
You might. I didn't actually check that before I came. The reason I didn't put quotes around it is it seems like the ampersand should be good enough as a separator, but I'm not positive. Yes, I think you're right. Like this, I believe. Is that it? Okay. Let me look it up eventually. There's something I remember, and I just was doing this off the top of my head, and I forget what is the separator for spaces. Something's the separator for spaces. Okay. But the basic idea is that when you're transmitting something using GET, it's essentially when the browser gets ready to transmit, it's basically got a URL, which is the script, and then this is using GET, and then there's a question mark, and then there's the form data. Okay, with POST, it's more secure. You have the URL, but that's basically it, and then the form data is included in an object that is sent, but it's harder for a hacker to transmit the data via a POST request. So POST is considered a more secure way of communicating with the server. So form data sent via a separate object, or conceptually. So I'll say conceptually. So POST is considered more secure, especially because it's a lot harder for a hacker to get access to things. And I learned this the hard way when I was implementing the CS code assessor site, because originally I was using GET for posting to the CS site. The problem with that was it's easy for a hacker to create a program, transmit it via this URL form data thing. So actually a hacker was able to, or would have been able to, transmit and execute a program on the code assessor site by bypassing the authentication that I was doing. So once I had to actually change over to POST because that stopped that from happening. Now hackers weren't able anymore to easily transmit a program through just giving a URL and form data. So GET basically is for read-only transactions, POST used when there's some kind of write that's going to go on the server side. Okay, then the action, as I said, is a path to a server-side script. It can either be a full URL or it can be a relative path name. So if you have something that says action, say equal scripts foo.php, then the server is going to find the directory from which, let's say the directory from which the HTML page was served was home, BVZ, web home, CS465, and the page that was served from that directory. Then the script would have that as the prefix, and in the CS465 directory, it would look for a subdirectory called scripts, and then look for a script called foo.php in the script subdirectory. So that's a relative path name. Pardon? You can't. So, so a relative path name does essentially hide the, you can't see this part. Like when you type web.eecs.utk.bvz/cs465, the actual address that you're going to is /home/bvz/webhome/cs465. So it actually is hiding the prefix. But you can't hide the suffix, the relative path name, because that's going to, if someone looks at the page source, they'll see it. It'll say, they'll see form method equals action equals. There's no way to hide that. Okay. So the next thing is that, let's see, I missed one thing with POST. There's a third reason we use POST. It's if we are transmitting binary data. So get, at least I don't believe I don't think it's capable of transmitting binary data. And get is. Okay, so you've got the form element. Next thing you want is to create widgets to collect your form data. And the original version of HTML gave you some basic widgets to use. So the basics, so pre-HTML5, you basically had a whole bunch of what I call selection widgets for entering data. And what you had were radio buttons, checkboxes, I'll call them action buttons. You had menus, and you had text boxes. Okay, those were essentially, and you had a couple, associated with text boxes, you had text areas. So we'll get into that. But these were essentially your 5 pre-HTML choices for entering things. And action buttons are things that look like OK buttons, cancel buttons. They're rectangles typically. Things you click and it invokes a command, whereas radio buttons and checkboxes, you're typically using those for selecting options. Now, again, the book didn't really give you guidelines on when you should be using each of these widgets, okay? So here's some considerations. First of all, radio buttons and checkboxes take up a lot of screen space, okay? Whereas menus don't. So here's a menu. When I drop it down, it's taking up a lot of screen space. But normally, the only thing you see for a menu is 1 or 2 word kind of label for the menu. And only when you activate the menu do you get the actual full list of what it can do. Whereas with radio buttons and checkboxes, they're always present, which means they take up a relatively big footprint on your graphical user interface. Text boxes take up a little bit less, but they still require some kind of footprint. So the rule of thumb is that if you have a few choices, you tend to use radio buttons and checkboxes. Otherwise, you use menus. So few choices, you typically use radio buttons. Many choices is menu. Okay, well that's kind of ambiguous. What does few mean? What does many mean? So a second rule comes into play, and that is human short-term memory. So just like computers have RAM, which is essentially fast memory that goes away when you turn off the computer, and then it has long-term permanent memory, humans have 2 types of memory, working memory and long-term memory. Your working memory is in effect your cache fast memory. It holds, for adults, on average 7 plus or minus 2 items at a time. So working memory can hold 7 plus or minus 2 items. So those who are lucky among us can hold up to about 9 items in working memory at once. Those less lucky can hold about 5. On average, we can hold about 7. That means that if you have roughly 7 radio or checkboxes on a screen, a human can look at them and instantly grasp all 7 of them, suck them into working memory. If you have more than that, on average, humans default to linear search. So for example, when you look at a count that has 3 things, pretty much all of us looking at could instantly take in all 3. This tools one, almost none of us can. We resort to linear search to try to find something on it. So generally, going back to few or many, you use radio buttons or checkboxes, generally set less than or equal to 7, generally menus with greater than 7. That's not a hard and fast rule. That's a soft but kind of a guideline. Okay, now if you have pizza toppings and there's more than 7, you'd probably still go with checkboxes. But that's a good rule of thumb. Okay, you'll notice that on this big menu, does anyone notice something that's being used to organize? Lines. And those lines are dividing those groups into things that are fewer than 7 items. So what you often do with big menus is you try to divide them into groups of related items. And that way, an expert looking at it knows roughly which part of the menu to look at. Then when they look at that part of the menu, like say line shape, regular polygon, irregular polygon, that's 5 items. I can take that all in one foul swoop. Okay? So what you want to do is try to get, not overwhelm a person's working memory. Okay? Actually, what also distinguishes novices from experts, the ability of experts to chunk information, which allows them to effectively hold more information in memory at any one time. So chess players, expert grandmasters recognize patterns on a chessboard. So they might remember 5 groupings, and those 5 groupings might comprise 30 pieces. Whereas a novice can actually only remember the positions of individual pieces. They might only be able to effectively hold memory for 7 pieces on the board. So the grandmaster is perhaps actually holding 30 pieces by chunking them into groups. So that's also why experts often perform better than novices at tasks. So at any rate, again, you won't find this in the textbook. Human working memory, plus or minus 2 items. Therefore, on radio buttons and checkboxes, typically they're used when you have fewer than 7, less than or equal to 7 choices. Also on menus, where you have more than 7 choices, you'll often see groupings of logically related items separated by those horizontal lines. That's also to allow for chunking when you look at the menu. Okay, action buttons are typically reserved for, typically reserved for commands. So you wouldn't normally use them to collect information. Usually they're for performing some kind of command. And then text boxes were used for essentially unlimited choices where you just couldn't limit the number. So for example, zip codes, there's just too many of them. Addresses, too many varieties. Whereas counties in the state of Tennessee is limited, so it would be in a menu, albeit a huge one. States, 50 of them. There's too many to represent those with radio buttons or checkboxes, so you would put them into a menu. Now, there's a lot of issues with text boxes. The big one being it's easy to enter the information incorrectly because you don't use the right format, you make a typo, all kinds of things. You want to avoid text boxes like the plague. Again, the book doesn't say that. So, there were a lot of things that people were having to enter by hand. Dates, telephone numbers, email addresses, colors. And when they developed HTML5, they came up with a whole bunch of widgets that were ideally suited for specific tasks. And in fact, this is where the textbook is helpful. So let's just quickly go. Okay, so starting in HTML5, there would be something for telephone input, which doesn't work so well with desktop browsers, but for mobile browsers, there typically does provide some formatting for what is expected. There's a date input picker. So if you say input type equals date, so most of the widgets we're talking about, they start with the tag input. And then you give a type as the attribute. And each browser will implement it differently, but the idea is when you create a date input type, the browser should be popping up some kind of nice menu widget that allows a user to easily select a date, and it will automatically be in the right format. What you're trying to do is stop the user from entering incorrect data. Okay, same thing with colors. If you say input type equals color, most browsers will now pop up some kind of color palette that allows you to input a color. So again, the user doesn't end up inputting an incorrect one. Okay, sliders. There are now ways to input numbers in different ways. So if you go for input type equals numbers, you get one of these little increment decrement buttons that allow you to enter numbers in a particular range, and it can actually control increments or decrements. So it might say the increment is 5, so if you hit the little increment button here, you'd get 305. And again, that stops the user from entering invalid values. If you get to the top of the range, the increment button will no longer work. If you get to the bottom of the range, the decrement button no longer works. Okay, there's a range input. Type equals range, and again, that's a slider. So it allows you to enter numeric values in a range. Now, anyone know what the issue is with those input types, HTML5 input types? They don't work in all browsers. So Chrome seems to be the most advanced in implementing these HTML5 types. Firefox is a bit further behind. So as the book talked about, there's often proxies that are used that if the browser doesn't support the particular input type, you can go to a commonly used toolkit like jQuery and use its implementation instead. So often you'll see code that asks what is the type of the browser. We will get to that when we get to JavaScript. And then depending on the type of the browser doesn't yet support that particular input type, you'll go out to a library and pull in a widget that will substitute for it. Okay? So questions about that. Again, what you're trying to do is avoid text boxes at all costs. Okay? And even sliders, even when you get to sliders, you have potentially some issues. Okay? So let's say that you wanted a number between 1 and 10,000. Do you think you could use a slider? No, probably not. Do you know why? You can't get that precise. Most displays only, if you have a good display, you might have 1 to 2,000 pixels across the screen. So that's the maximum you could allocate to a slider because each value would have to be mapped to 1 pixel. So if you only have 1,000 pixels, you could only have a slider with 1,000 values. Do you think that would work well? Why not? To try to get because it's very hard to get to exactly 887 when just a slight tremor of your finger will take it to 886 or 888. So typically you'd want several pixels to map to 1 value. So little tremors in your finger won't change the value. So with 1,000 pixels, you might only get, say, 250 to 333 values for a slider because you'd probably want to give 3 or 4 pixels per value. So you have to think about all these factors when deciding what kind of widget to use. Okay? I love asking test questions where I give you scenarios like this and I ask you for the best type of widget to use. That's a big hint as to what you can expect on the final exam. Okay? And all of these widgets have various attributes then that the book goes over, and I'm not going to bore you with horribly except for this one. A great one, pattern. So when you're forced to use a text box, you still often want to format or force the information to be entered in a certain format. Like a social security number should be 3 digits dash 2 digits dash 4 digits. So the pattern attribute allows you to specify a regular expression. We won't get to regular expressions until PHP, so don't worry about it, but you should just be aware that the pattern attribute is a great one to be associated with text boxes because it's great for type checking. Essentially, it says any input that comes in must match this pattern. In this case, it's saying the input must start with A, B, or C as the first character, and the second character must be a digit between 0 and 9. So B7 would be acceptable, Z6 would not, Z12 would not. Okay, B12 would not. So this is limiting you to information that matches a certain pattern. The pattern is basically regular expressions based on Perl, which, as I say, we'll get to. Don't worry about it too much. Just know that that exists. Things like min and max are good for the number and date and range ones because they basically control what is the minimum like date that could be entered or the maximum date that could be entered. Okay. Yes.
Let's say I make a page that have a user enter a password. But let's say if I have them enter text, will there be any difference between password and text and how it's digested by the HTML?
So yes, so you can actually, if you want them to enter a password, you should use the type equals password, but you should be aware of what that really means. All it does is visually it blots out the characters. That's why when you type, you see the little dots appear for a password. But if you just then sent that information over the internet, it would be unencrypted. Okay, it would not, the password would not be protected. So the only benefit that you get from type equals password is that someone looking over your shoulder can't discern what your password is, but someone sniffing the network could. Okay, so yes, you would typically use type equals password for any information that is secure that prying eyes shouldn't be able to see, but it doesn't stop a sniffer, internet sniffer, from doing it. You're welcome. Other questions about this? Okay. Now, another thing the book did not really make clear and that you are going to see and that is confusing. Okay, there are 3 main attributes that you care about. Okay, and they are, so 3, I'll call 3 big attributes in forms, in form widgets. Again, the book didn't talk about the big 3. Okay, that is ID equals, name equals, value equals. ID and name in particular confuse people because they seem to be the same thing, but they're different, have different meanings. So ID is something used by the browser. Okay, so it's meant to be a unique tag or unique name that the browser can use for styling, for CSS styling. So it's also used by JavaScript to get access to that form widget. So it's a unique name that for the browser to use, either for CSS styling or for JavaScript. The name is also supposed to be unique. Okay, but unique name over everything on the web page. So unique name over the entire web page. Over an entire web page. The name only needs to be unique within a form. Unique within a form. Okay, used by the server as a key to access this widget's value. Okay, which leaves us with the value, which is the value of the widget. So it's the value that is transmitted to the server. So when things are transmitted, when form data is transmitted to the server, it goes in name value pairs. So the name is the keyword, the value is the value. And when it's on the server, it goes into a hash table, which is then accessible from a server-side script. Okay, so form data basically comes into server-side scripts in the form of a hash table or dictionary. So ID and name are not the same. Okay, there's an important distinction between them. The ID is for the browser. The name is for the server. With widgets, you often see both. And you sometimes see people using the same label for both of them, which isn't necessary, especially because the name only has to be unique within the form, whereas the ID has to be unique within the web page. We clear on that? That's really important. Okay. So most widgets have additional information associated with them, like a text box will have parameters for the maximum number of characters you can put into a text box, a parameter for the number of characters that can appear at one time. So you might be able to fit 100 characters into a text box, but you only want the text box to be 10 characters wide. So there's different attributes that control that. Okay? So, but these are the big three. And then, like I said, most of the widgets, selection widgets, start with, actually I should say, there is a fourth one, and that is type equals. So normally, type equals specifies the type. So I really should say the big four. So I'll change it to the big four. Okay, specifies the type of the widget. And normally input is the tag for that. Okay, there is one exception. So if we find menus, this is so annoying. Menus are special. They use the select tag rather than the input tag. Okay, as someone who does graphical user interfaces, this is so annoying because consistency is everything. There's no reason why they couldn't have used input type equals menu, but no, they had to use a special tag that you must memorize, and which of course I never can remember, and I'm always looking up, like I just did, for a menu. So it starts with the select tag, pretty much the only input widget that has its own tag associated with it. And then the individual options are option words. So a menu has then nested tags for all the options that go into it. Okay, and you'll notice that here, value equals soccer, so that is actually the tag name used. This is also inconsistent, so this comes to something else that will puzzle you if you're not careful. If you would think with a radio button that if you said input type equals radio, value equals, say, studio for a studio apartment, you would think that when the radio button came up that perhaps it might come up with the label studio. You would be wrong. Radio buttons do not come up with labels. You have to provide them yourself. So if you wanted that to appear on studio to appear on the right-hand side, you would have to then put studio as a label right after the input tag. This is stupid in my opinion, but you must remember to do that. Or if you want it to appear on the left-hand side so that it looks like this, then you have to put studio to the left of the radio button. Dumb, dumb, dumb. But that is the way it is done. Okay? And you'll often see label used. So you'll even say label, and then it can refer to, and of course I forget off the top of my head, so we'll look it up. Not there though. Here. Label for equals. There we go. So you can even have label for equals, and I could say this would now be an ID, equals studio, say. And I could say for equals studio. Notice I'm using the ID, not the name. And actually make sure that's right. Yes, ID. Whoops. That won't work either. So I could say this label studio. And you might think, oh, that will cause studio to be put next to the radio button. No, it won't. That is used for accessibility purposes. So for example, people who are visually impaired, they're screen readers. And that is a way for a screen reader to know, the label tag is a way for the screen reader to know that when it sees a radio button that it should call out studio for that radio button. That's why you use labels, for accessibility, not to visually label the button. So the value field does not cause a label to appear for either radio buttons, checkboxes, or text boxes. But for menu items, they do. So the value of a menu item is the same as its label, but not true for radio buttons, text boxes, or checkboxes. Got that? So I don't get Piazza posts wondering why I used value for my radio button and it doesn't show up? Yes. You could still do option and just have a closing input type. There's no reason why they couldn't have just said input here and then have input at the end. Now I know that most inputs don't have a closing tag. There's no reason they couldn't have had a closing tag, right? Maybe, sorry, this is me ranting. They also could have, for radio buttons and check boxes and text boxes, also allowed you to put a label and then a closing input tag, and then we'd have a label associated with each of them. But they didn't do that either. Okay? It's just like, why? I don't know, because these are logical ideas, and I see people try, especially students, try to do it, and it doesn't work, and it's like, yeah, it makes sense, but they didn't do it that way. So, beats me. I'd love to talk to whoever designed it. My guess is they did it fast and they didn't really think about all these things. Other questions, because I do love to rant. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Is there like a way to know which one's the ending tag and which one's the, or is it just sort of something you get used to?
So ending tags are always got a slash.
Right. You know, I mean, like, it's something like, for instance.
Oh, which things have ending tags and which don't?
Yeah.
You learn.
Okay.
Yep. You just learn. Yep. There's no rhyme nor reason to that either. I guess the idea with is that if it has a ending tag, it's because there's going to be some information that is supposed to appear in the document. Okay? Whereas if it doesn't have an ending tag, then basically the information that it needs to convey is all in the attributes. But again, it seems to be a little bit random. You memorize.
I figured I just didn't know.
No, there's not. Okay, they even changed. That used to be everything was supposed to be closed with one. So like even if you did a horizontal ruler, you were supposed to also have a closing horizontal ruler. It was supposed to be like either you would see code that looked like HR, like that, which looks silly, or you would just see that, which was supposed to be, was it that or was it with the slash at the end? I forget, but, pardon? Slash at the end. Thanks, Kelsey. So it's supposed to be like that to indicate both a opening and closing tag. Now they've reformed it and they just say if something doesn't need a closing tag, just write it as HR, which is what? The most sensible way to do it. But you'll see old code that looks like this, and that's why it was written prior to the current standards. So actually, I'm not going to chat about it today, but you definitely should look at the HTML developer guidelines because they actually do give good tips for how you should write your HTML. And that's one of them, about when you close and when you don't. Okay, anything else? Da, 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 da. Okay, going way back, this is very simple, but I said there were three things. The submit button, that's pretty easy. Input, type equals submit will give you a submit button. And if you hit the submit button, then it calls the action, the script. It bundles everything up and it will send it to the server. Now there's a caveat to that which we won't get into right now. There's a way to stop form data from being submitted to the server if there's an error in the form data, but we'll get to that when we talk about JavaScript. So for the time being, you can just assume that if they hit the submit button, that the form data will be bundled up according to the get or post method, and then it will be sent to the server. Now, you have enough information with all of this to do the first homework assignment. So let me just talk about that for a moment. So the first homework assignment is designing the web interface. It's pretty succinct. So if you have questions about it, post them to Piazza, okay, because many people might have the questions. But basically, you are going to come up with your own design, okay? I've given you some design rules that you can use. So for example, that's why I just went through all of the different widgets and why I told you what were the kind of design rules for radial buttons, checkboxes, and menus. So I want you to use your imagination in designing that website. Also, we haven't gotten to the CSS part yet, so the homework assignment isn't really something I expect you to completely be able to do yet, but you can certainly start thinking about it. When you are actually laying out the widgets, you can use CSS, Cascading Style Sheets, which is what we will get to on Thursday and on Tuesday. So with the form widgets, you're not really trying to control the layout. You're just trying to say these are the widgets we're using. And then CSS is organizing them into a physical structure on the page and also saying how they should be styled with respect to font and color and all those other things. Now I will say one thing. CSS is pretty weak on physical layout. And oftentimes developers resort to using tables to organize form data. If you want to use tables to organize your form data, I am okay with that. I think CSS is still pretty weak with respect to that. Yes, Rusty?
Will we be able to link to Bootstrap and then
No, no. I don't want you linking to external toolkits. Okay, the reason is, at least initially, I want you to know the native HTML so that, because ultimately, you have to be comfortable with native HTML even if you're using those other tools. Same thing with CSS. I want you to use the native commands. Essentially, I know I'm making you use assembly language, okay? HTML, native CSS is like assembly language. I admit it, okay? But I still want you to use it because I want you to be familiar with it, okay? So please don't use any toolkits for homework 6. Native HTML, native CSS. Yes, it's a pain in the neck, but I want you to know the basic stuff because once you go out in the real world, you'll be better for it when you start using the libraries and the so-called higher level languages. Okay, so final thing, Thursday is engineering day. This class doesn't meet because it is an undergraduate and graduate class. However, you'll notice you're not off the hook because there is a fairly simple basic CSS for Thursday. So you still are expected to have the pre-class activities done by Thursday at 12:30. And there are still these in-class, they're due 2 days later on Saturday. So even though there's no class on Thursday, there is still the web programming that is chapter 4, and it is covering basic CSS. And then you'll see next Tuesday, we get into advanced CSS and an introduction to PHP. Okay? So with that, I'll turn you loose. You're free to go. If you want to work on the in-class activities that are due on Thursday, feel free. I can certainly stick around for 15 minutes to help you if you want, but you are free to go.